A friend of mine is a child psychologist, and she tells me that very often she will give her young patients toys and be part of play therapy, believing that as they work out various instruments and toys, they can begin to work out issues, trauma, or angst in their life. She told me recently about a young patient, of course, confidentially and without names, that this young boy was given some different toys, and he chose the soldiers who happened to be among the toys, and he deployed these soldiers in such a way that there was one side and another side. And as he began to work this out in his field of play, he all of a sudden looked up at my friend, the psychologist, and said, "The enemy lines are hard to figure out." He's right. It's hard to figure out the enemy lines. Oh, but we try. We try daily to try to pinpoint who the folks are who are the enemies, and who's in and who's out, scapegoating and blaming and shaming, trying to keep ourselves, of course, on the side of the good people, on the side of purity. The enemy lines are hard to find. In late 1944, when the Allies were already advancing across Europe after the successes in Normandy, J.R.R. Tolkien, famous for the Lord of the Rings, wrote an op-ed piece to the British press. He was upset, you see, because he kept reading during the summer and fall of '44 about the evils of Germany, where the writers were depicting all Germans as the evil ones and all the Allies as the good ones. One of them even talked about systemic extermination, that is, the ruin of all of Germany and all of German people. They're rattlesnakes, one person wrote, and they don't know the difference between good and evil. In Tolkien's op-ed piece, he said, well, how about the writers themselves? Do they have some blend of good and evil in them? How do you and I decide day by day about moral and immoral, good and evil, who's in and who's out, who's in the streak of Christ-likeness and who's not? We've been taught our lessons. All of us have been taught many moral lessons about who's in and who's out, good behaviors and bad behaviors, all according, of course, to our own culture, our own religious upbringing, our own heritage, our hermeneutic, the lens through which we look at the world. But most of the time, you and I have to figure out that we simply don't know enough about most people and most circumstances to make absolutely definitive conclusions about their worth and their value and their morals. Recently, a Palestinian father was catechizing his Palestinian son. He asked him, "Who are the evil ones?" The young boy then was instructed to say, "The Israelis are the ruthless enemy." Across town, an Israeli father was catechizing his son. "Who are those evil people who squat on our land?" the Israeli father asked his son. "And what will you do to them when you grow up?" The boy was taught to reply, "I will kill the filthy Palestinians." One day it's the Germans. The next day, it's the Israelis or the Palestinians. The next week, it's those who are gay. Next month, it's those who are African American or Hispanic. Last week, it was those who crossed the border illegally. It's those people over there, on the other side, those folks who are different from myself. Václav Havel, the one-time president of the Czech Republic during the Soviet communism rule, wrote these words: "The line between good and evil, benevolence and disdain, did not run clearly between them and us, but through each person. No one was simply a victim. Everyone was in some measure co-responsible." He was echoing, of course, something that Alexander Solzhenitsyn had written previously when he said, "The line separating love and hate, good and evil, passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties, but through every human heart. The line shifts inside us. It oscillates," Solzhenitsyn writes, "from one experience to the next, from one year to the next. You and I are moral and good 1 week or 1 hour, and the next week or hour we're not." Which brings me to the gospel text for this Good Shepherd Sunday. Always from John chapter 10, all 3 years, we hear again how the Good Shepherd penetrates the human realities, comes among all the sheep, gives his voice, gives his benevolence, gives his grace, his care, his protection. Jesus is called the Good Shepherd. Raymond Brown goes on to say, Jesus wasn't just a good shepherd, Jesus was the model shepherd. It's on his modeling that you and I find grace and moral. It's there that Christ lets us know about goodness and about righteousness and about justice, but most especially about the quality of love, especially agape love, that unconditional, forgiving love. It's in Christ that you and I learn about the Good Shepherd, the model who lays down his life for not just some of the sheep, for all of the sheep. In fact, we're told that he goes out to look for the one, leaving the 99. The psalm, of course, the timeless Psalm 23, reminds us of these themes when the psalmist declares that God, as the Good Shepherd, leads us through the valley of the shadow of death, comes alongside of us in the darkness when life is harsh and mean and ugly, when humans do damage to each other, when we do damage to the earth, when groups war with each other, when we have disdain for one another, when injustice has been served and now accountability needs to be known. We're told by the psalmist that God leads us through that valley of death and leads us then beside still waters, restores our soul, we're told, gives us a radical transformation, enables us to live into our godly purpose. But let's be clear, this isn't an exercise of moralism or ritualism. It's not as if you and I can take ourselves by our collar and raise ourselves up and just say, if I tried harder to be moral, if I just read the right books, a how-to book, or got myself to shape up in some miraculous way, then I would be able to live into this purpose of the Good Shepherd. This is not a moral equation of moralism. Moralism is a moral grid that sets itself down in the world and decides who's moral and who's not. You may remember the Greek myth story, Procrustes. Procrustes ran a bed and breakfast, we might say. And as guests came, if they were really short in stature, Procrustes would give them the room with the long beds. And Procrustes would then stretch the short people into long people through a painful, agonizing process, would make them fit the bed. If you happen to be a tall person and you visited Procrustes' bed and breakfast, he would give you a short bed. And the limbs, arms and legs that stuck out, he would amputate them so that you would again fit the bed. The moral of the story, of course, is that moralism is about making people fit our categories, what we believe is good, what we believe is righteous. God's benevolent grace as the Good Shepherd is not based on moralism, it's based on love. It's based on an agape love that comes alongside of us and tends to us. But as Richard Rohr has said recently, this type of religion is not a carrot on a stick approach to religion, whereby we claim a moral higher ground than others, thumping our chest of purity, holiness, and loyalty to God. He goes on to say, there are always outsiders to be kept outside with this kind of religion. Hiding around the edges of this mode of moral purity are the evils called slavery and sexism, wholesale classism, greed, national conquest, gay oppression, and the diminishment of native cultures. He concludes that section by saying, this moralism becomes a warmed-over civil religion rather than the deep, abiding good news of the shepherd who leaves the 99 and seeks out the lost one with love and mercy. The Good Shepherd, then, is like a benevolent mother, if you will. This benevolent mother brings us into the world. She feeds us, nourishes us. When we damage ourselves, she binds up our wounds. Along the way, she teaches us lessons. She encourages us to find our talents and our purpose, our wheelhouse. She provides opportunities and experiences that enables us to grow into our full stature. She lays down house rules but doesn't henpeck us. When we make mistakes, when we're selfish or peevish or unfair, mean or cruel or unjust, she holds us accountable for our actions. She doesn't look the other way. She doesn't excuse us. Sometimes she even puts us in the corner in time out or sends us to bed without supper. But she always, without exceptions, loves us to the end. She will give her life over to us. She will give us all of her resources with which to have a meaningful and purposeful life. This household of a benevolent mother is full of all of God's children. It's a diverse community that lives in this household. And she expects all the children to not only get along, but to learn to respect and appreciate each other. When one child is experiencing damage or meanness or disdain from someone else or some other group, she goes and looks after them. She holds them up. She respects their image. She seeks to bring them into their full purpose. So then what's our response to that Good Shepherd who comes alongside of us and leads us beside the still waters, that nourishes us, comforts us, heals us when we're damaged, and seeks us out when we're lost? It is, isn't it, that you and I would become like the Good Shepherd, that we would take on some shepherding qualities ourselves, that the love that we've experienced from the Good Shepherd would then exude and show forth in the way that we live our lives day by day. In Jonathan Kozol's book, Amazing Grace, he describes a 12-year-old boy named Anthony in the Bronx, New York. Anthony has a lisp, has a hard time speaking, is smaller than the other boys, is not very athletic. He's put out and put down. He's called names. He's pushed aside, left out of the circles. Anthony is always sort of the last and the least and the lost. However, he finds St. Anne's Episcopal Church. He finds it as a haven of blessing. He finds a family, a community. He finds a place where they love him and care for him. He finds a place where his needs are provided, where he can participate and offer his own talents. He meets up with Martha Overall, who's the rector. She once had a thriving law practice, but decided instead to go to seminary and offer herself in priesthood. She's now the rector of St. Anne's. Kozal, in his book, describes the rector this way. She rises at 5 a.m. She seldom seems to finish work much before 10 at night. When people are sick, she takes them to the hospital. When young adults are arrested, she goes with them to court. After children are born, she baptizes them. The day I visited with her, she had a mop and a bucket in the hallway. She could have remained a lawyer, making a handsome figure and living in a nice condominium in Uptown. Instead, she finds herself now as a rector, as a homemaker, as a nurse, as a police officer, as a lawyer. In her case, loving God and neighbor means being the local pastor, leading the downtrodden by places where they can find new life. Kozal concludes the section by saying, I can see why Anthony has found a wonderful community, because he has found a wonderful shepherd. Indeed, whenever the ministry of Christ as the Good Shepherd comes our way, touches our soul, brings us into our purpose, helps us to deal with the good and evils of the world, then you and I are compelled then to take on some of the features of the Good Shepherd, to penetrate our life into that mixture of good and evil day by day. So in the midst of this world, where enemy lines are hard to find, where it's hard to know the difference between the shepherd and the shyster, between being led and being misled, between being blessed and bamboozled, between those who pray for the flock and those who prey on the flock, it's good to be known and loved by the Good Shepherd who leads us beside still waters, who puts his life on the line for the sake of the whole flock and expects no less from us.